up today for everyone that visits the website here. Special guest on the telephone, Dr. Kevin Gutzman, author of the book Who Killed the Constitution and the Politically Incorrect Guide to the Constitution. Let's see here. We have some really good questions here, but the Reverend X in the other room, Kevin, wanted he wanted to hear the rest of the explanation for the interstate rape clause.
Yes, well, okay, so the court, hearing a case about this, decided Biden had pushed this to an absurd extreme, and even the federal courts would not allow Congress to say that rape was interstate commerce. So they struck down that section of Biden's statute, which, by the way, that's a statute that Biden still boasts about having authored.
Well, he boasts about a lot of things, and we could get into there's a piece out in the Wall Street Journal today. Pete Hegseth wrote a piece about all of Biden's foreign policy Fox passes, where he found himself on the wrong side of the argument 6 times in a row here, going all the way back to 1978. And one of the most egregious ones was he actually proposed that in 1978 that in order to shut up the Iranians, we should just pay them $200 million. We should just pay them $200 million. Now, that brings me to constitutional question number 67 here for the good doctor here. And I just had to laugh when I heard this. And this just passes without muster, Kevin, and I'm sure if you were watching the news about the hurricanes, you probably laughed or cried, maybe cried. And that was that yesterday, this was all over the news, after visiting the wreckage of Hurricane Ike, President Bush pledged that he would pay, the federal government would pay for all the cleanup of all the damage that Ike had done. He would just go ahead and pay for it. And I'm sitting there screaming at the television. That's really nice, President. It sounds really good. But don't you even just kind of have to tip your hat in the direction of the Constitution and say, well, I'm going to ask Congress to appropriate some money to do this and see if the legislative branch wants to tackle this. Did you see that, and what do you think about it?
Well, it's of a piece with the government takeover of AIG. You notice that Congress had nothing to do with that either. President Bush, you recall, is the president who famously said of the Constitution, don't tell me about that. It's just a scrap of paper. So apparently he had a glancing familiarity with it, too. I find these actions by President Bush to be totally unsurprising. Now, I remember actually in 1988, this is a little bit off the subject, but I remember in 1988 a friend of mine was supporting the older Bush for president in the Republican primaries, and I said to him, don't you remember in 1980 when Reagan was running for president, President Bush, the elder, then Vice President Bush, was the candidate who stood for the opposite of every one of Reagan's positions. He didn't like his attitude about the SALT START treaties. He didn't like his attitude about the Panama Canal. He didn't like his attitude about the Cold War generally. He didn't like his tax cuts, which he called voodoo economics.
Right.
He took the position opposite Reagan's on every one of Reagan's platform planks. So when these fellows, these Bushes, get into office and behave as if they were Democrats, why should we be surprised? They are.
Well, they are.
I live in Connecticut. I can tell you, I actually tell relatives of mine who aren't from Connecticut, in Connecticut you have a choice. You can vote for higher taxes, gay marriage, and pro-abortion, or you can vote for the Democrat.
Well, I always like to refer back to an interview that Ayn Rand gave with Mike Wallace in 1959. We played this audio from time to time, where she says both of the parties, both Republican and Democrat, are both basically promoting socialism today. Neither one of the parties is following the Constitution as it was written. I don't know if you've heard that, but it's fantastic. And I think that was the last time that was said, other than when I say it.
Well, I hate to keep tooting my own horn, but that's what I do. I recently had an article on TalkieMag.com where I pointed out that essentially the Reagan Goldwater wing of the Republican Party is defunct, and what we're left with now are essentially 2 socialist parties, one that's out and out socialist and one that claims not to be. I see no real distinction when it comes to philosophy between McCain and Obama. I cannot detect a difference when it comes to the Constitution.
I did hear McCain the other day say that he was asked on that goofball show, The View, about the Constitution, and slavery came up. Whoopi Goldberg said, "You want me to go back to being a slave? Should I be concerned? Should I be a slave?" And McCain actually deftly pointed out that there's nothing in the Constitution about slavery. And, of course, she argued with it. Well, it was written by a bunch of slave owners, the usual stuff there. He's not total. He references. I've heard him reference it. That doesn't mean that he's right. But I've heard him reference it more than I've heard President Bush reference it. Seems like that he may have actually read it at one point in time.
There actually is an amendment now that prohibits slavery, you know.
That's what I said. There's three of them. 14, 15, and 16 have to do with it. They're post-slavery amendments. Post-Civil War amendments, I should say.
13, 14, and 15.
13, 14, and 15. And then we're going to take a walk back down memory lane here for about 20 seconds. Kevin, I'll play you that Ayn Rand clip, and then we'll take our next call.
But the majority of the people has never been given a choice. You know that both parties today are for socialism, in effect, for controls, and there is no party. There are no voices to offer an actual pro-capitalist, laissez-faire economic freedom and individualism.
So that was from 1959.
Well, isn't this, again, this gets back to what I was saying earlier about the current troubles in the economy. Obama says we need to raise taxes on the rich and have more regulation, and McCain says we need to find the greedy people on Wall Street. This has nothing to do with the actual problem, which is the government is inflating the money supply. That is the issue, and nobody will ever talk about it. It's really somewhat astounding if you're familiar with the sweep of American political history, because as I said before, used to be this was a central point. When William Jennings Bryan ran for president as a Democratic nominee, he made a famous speech in which he said that capitalists shouldn't be allowed to crucify people on a cross of gold. He was talking about the value of the dollar. That was a central issue, and now it's just never mentioned.
He lost 3 times, too, though, didn't he?
He lost, yes, because he wanted inflation, and the other party stood for the idea of a sound money. So I'd say the good guys won. He should have lost, but the point is that in those days they talked about it.
And it wasn't. I've often tried to reinvigorate the audience's love of history and to encourage them to go back and read. To go back and read the Constitution, but not only that, to go read what these men were, go read what they were reading. If you really want to understand it, and you've done this, you've done it exceptionally well beyond the pale of what anyone else has done that I've ever encountered, Dr. Gutzman. But if you go back and read what these guys were reading, what they were writing to their friends, and what they were talking about, it all makes sense. People say, well, you're so smart, Mike. I'm not smart. I'm repeating stuff that I've heard real smart guys say. These aren't my ideas. I didn't come up with any of this. I didn't grow up I didn't come of age during the American Enlightenment, post-1776, or any of that stuff. I'm just regurgitating it, but that just pays testament and homage, in my estimation, to just how brilliant they were and how stupid we are. Not we as in the royal we, not you and me in present company. So let me clarify that. We have another question from a listener. This is Pat in Tennessee. Pat, go right ahead.
How you doing?
Fine, sir.
Good. From one patriot to another, happy Constitutional Day.
Well, thank you. Happy Constitution Day to you, too. What's your question for the good doctor?
I have a question. The federal government's only really responsible to do about 4 or 5 different things, like the military and maybe keep up